Chapter 11, The Triumphs and Travails of Jeffersonian Democracy. We're going to be discussing Thomas Jefferson quite a bit in this chapter. Huge figure in history, although very controversial, as we will talk about. I mean, we've discussed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. I mean, he's already done a lot in his young life. He was Secretary of State, the first ever Secretary of State. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a political leader of Virginia, just really well respected. On the flip side, he does some things like, a power grab attempt, which was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, albeit that, it was probably warranted for him to try to get rid of another power grab from the Federalists with their Alien and Sedition Acts. There's that, and there's the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal, yet he had over 150 slaves at Monticello, his home in Virginia. So to say that Thomas Jefferson was consistently inconsistent is an understatement, because he very much was, and we still have a lot to talk about with Thomas Jefferson. In 1800, Jefferson and Adams, this is a rematch of the 1796 election. So this is the second time John Adams defeated Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1796. And according to the Constitution, as we know, the flaw that was in the Constitution that the Founding Fathers didn't really know about political parties, and that they said whoever had the most votes was going to be president, whoever had the second most votes was going to be vice president. So it set up a horrible situation with John Adams and his political rival Thomas Jefferson as his vice president. So yeah, it wasn't the best of scenarios. They didn't get along real well. Interesting relationship between these two. Very complicated. Again, remind me to tell you the story about the death of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on the same day in history. And I think I said that last chapter, but do remind me in class to talk about that. John Adams was going in here. He's the incumbent. He's running. He wants to run for a second term. He wants to go for 8 years at least. I say at least because there was no 2-term limit at this time, only a tradition. He was hurt by the Alien and Sedition Acts because they were what they were. They were power grab. It was a power grab attempt to try to reduce the power of the Democrat-Republican Party and to allow for the Federalists to maintain power for a long time by keeping the Democrat-Republicans down. He was exposed. He was exposed by Jefferson, actually, because of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And now you have Thomas Jefferson, the head of his own party, the Democrat-Republican Party. And, Thomas Jefferson, there were rumors about the fact that he fathered numerous children with one of his slaves, a woman by the name of Sally Hemings. That rumor has been confirmed within the last, 25 years or so with the use of DNA, the new technology. About 25 years ago, they were able to compare known descendants of Thomas Jefferson with African-American descendants who say they were related to Jefferson. And they did the DNA analysis, and they confirmed that, yes, Thomas Jefferson did have a long-standing relationship with Sally Hemings. So I'll talk more about that here in a minute. But Jefferson was also accused of being an atheist, although he really was not. He was what was called a deist. He believed in a supreme being, but that supreme being didn't control the universe all the time. That they created the universe, but didn't control it all the time. But people perceived him as being godless. So yeah, you had these two going for the presidency. Now the other issue here is that you don't want to have what happened before. So you don't want to have, let's say Thomas Jefferson wins this election and then John Adams goes from being the president to then serving under Thomas Jefferson as vice president. Didn't make much sense. So they try to work around for this election, a workaround. They gave every elector in the Electoral College 2 votes. One would go for the president, one would go for the vice president, and then someone, they designate who it was supposed to throw their vote to someone else. and thus get a winner. So you could see the graph right here is the loser of the election, John Adams, that he gained 65 electoral votes, with the 65 electors each having 2 votes each. One vote was supposed to go to Adams, the other vote was supposed to go to Pinckney, his vice presidential candidate, and then the last guy to vote was supposed to throw his vote to somebody else, which they did. They threw it to John Jay, who wasn't even running for president. So thus you have 65, 64 to 1. Now, here's where the problem came in, is Thomas Jefferson had 73 electoral votes and perceived going into the Electoral College that he was the winner of the election. The electors, having 2 electoral votes, were supposed to go 1 for Jefferson, 1 for Burr, and the last guy to vote was supposed to throw his vote to somebody else. So it should have been 73 to 72 to 1, and Jefferson would be declared the winner of the election. Well, there's a lot of political finagling going on. And anyways, Aaron Burr always had wanted to become president of the United States. So that elector somehow, in a secret deal, was told to throw his vote to Burr instead of throwing it to somebody else. So it created a tie in the Electoral College. And according to the Constitution, you know that any tie, or if someone doesn't get a majority in the Electoral College, that you throw it into the House, and the House decides who the winner of the election is going to be. So yeah, the House now had to decide between Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate, Burr. The honorable thing for Burr to do would have been to step up and say, I was not running for president. I'm meant to be the vice president. Give your vote to somebody else, or tell the House, vote for Jefferson. He did not. He thought, oh, I could take advantage of this situation. And you know that there are a lot of Federalists in the House, and therefore they would love to see a guy like Aaron Burr, who wasn't as capable as Jefferson. He wasn't as well respected. He was a bit of, dare I say, a sleazeball. So they would love to see, in the eyes of the Federalists in the House, they would love to see a situation where Burr becomes president, screws everything up, and then 4 years later in 1804, the Federalists would be the knights in shining armor, and they'd take over the presidency again and fix everything that Burr would screw up. That was what they saw in their mind. So they went back and forth in the House of Representatives, and for weeks they couldn't decide who the president was going to be. Finally, the Speaker of the House said, nobody leaves the House, no food, no water, until everybody comes to a conclusion about who the president's going to be. And that's when none other than Federalist Alexander Hamilton, who hated Jefferson with a passion, comes in and says, and tells the House of Representatives, look, Burr is a jerk. Don't vote for him. He'll screw this country up. We're too young of a country to put it in the hands of a guy like Aaron Burr. So he said, I don't like Jefferson, but vote for him anyway, because he's the lesser of 2 evils. So they threw the next round happened, and the votes went to Jefferson, and Jefferson became president of the United States. And Alexander Hamilton gained a big enemy in Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was furious with them, and we'll talk about what's going to happen in a few minutes here. But here's Sally Hemings, kind of a creepy story. Now I'm going to read this to you. It's pretty creepy. Sally Hemings, I got this out of a book that I read about Thomas Jefferson. It says here, Betty Hemings gave birth to Jefferson's father-in-law, John Wales, 6 children out of wedlock. So yeah, that was Jefferson's father-in-law. Jefferson was married before his wife died. The youngest of Betty Hemings' children, John Wales, was named Sally. She was born in 1773, just around the time Wales died. As a girl of just 14, she will become the personal slave of Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Mary Jefferson, the newborn infant who had just come into the world. Jefferson's wife, Martha, died after giving birth to Mary. Thanks to Sally's mother's sexual relations with Wales, Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, is a blood relation to Sally Hemings, her half-sister. Even more shocking is that once she comes of age, And for 20 years after that, Sally Hemings will share Master Jefferson's bed as his lover, and she has numerous children by him. So yeah, at 14 years old, Sally Hemings was Jefferson's daughter's nanny. And yeah, so I told you he's consistently inconsistent. There's some stories that pretty harsh realities about Thomas Jefferson and many other of the early founding fathers. So this is about I just talked about the controversy in the election and went through the whole thing with Aaron Burr, so you've heard about that. Well, in the end, Jefferson becomes president, and the Democrat Republicans are calling it the Revolution of 1800. In this case, revolution doesn't mean war. In this case, revolution means to go around. So think about this, and it's in the news today. It's the first ever transfer of power from one party to another party. The Federalists under Adams were in charge for 4 years. Jefferson wins the election, Jefferson defeats Adams, becomes president. So it's a transfer of power from one party to another party, and it was bloodless. Now you wonder why they question Trump today about bloodless transfer of power. Are you going to allow this to be a bloodless transfer of power, or a peaceful transfer of power? Well, we have a history in this country that goes back to 1800 that every time one president takes over for another president, there's no bloodshed. Doesn't happen all over the world. I'll tell you that. Even in 2020, it doesn't happen all over the world. So it was a peaceful transfer, and they wanted to make sure that it was a peaceful transfer. And that's in question right now. We'll see what happens here. I told you I was going to talk about the Hamilton-Burr issues. Well, there was another incident where Burr was running for governor of New York, and Alexander Hamilton came out publicly in a speech in New York, because Hamilton was also from New York, and he told the people of New York, do not vote for Burr. He's an idiot. And Burr didn't get elected, and Burr was furious, so he challenged Hamilton to a duel. Right? They walked this off, and they were like one of those old-fashioned duels. There was a referee involved, and he would keep the two muskets that you could see right there. There was correspondence back and forth. They would set a date. The referee would set a date, and they would say, this is the date we're going to duel. And they would hope that at some point they would be able to communicate via letters, that they could come to some kind of a compromise or something, and that they wouldn't end up dueling. And as it turned out, nope, they didn't do that. They went to Weehawken, New Jersey. They crossed the Hudson River to go to where dueling was legal in New Jersey. And they paced it off, and they fired at each other. Hamilton's shot was so wild, they thought that he did it on purpose. So it was commonplace for two to come to a compromise that they would both shoot to miss in a duel. That was common, because neither wanted to die, and neither wanted to be looked on as cowardly by backing off of by chickening out, they would say, in a duel. So they would both shoot to miss on purpose, and they would shake hands, and then the whole argument was over, and everybody lives happily ever after type thing. So yeah, they think that historians believe that Hamilton thought that they were both going to miss on purpose. Well, Hamilton missed horribly, and Burr did not. So Burr his bullet was a fatal one for Hamilton. Hamilton died shortly after, and the world was robbed of a very smart man in Alexander Hamilton. That's for sure. Here, a little bit interesting, something I was also reading this in a book about Burr being wanted for murder. Dueling on paper was illegal in both New York and New Jersey, but it wasn't prosecuted vigorously in New Jersey. So duelists would row across the Hudson River, although after Burr killed Hamilton, he was wanted for murder in 2 states, so New Jersey and New York. In fact, It's a bizarre story. He was wanted for murder in New York and New Jersey. So where did he flee? He fled to Washington. And because he was still vice president, he presided over the impeachment trial of Supreme Court justice in the United States Senate, even though he was wanted for murder in 2 states. And then he would eventually resign as vice president of the United States, and he would flee out west. And he spent the rest of his life in New Orleans and tried to, get New Orleans to secede from the United States at the time, but he was unsuccessful in doing that. So Burr was a little bit shady, I guess you could say. All right, so Adams was the one and only Federalist president we've ever had in this country. However, if you look at the way that the government is today, it's way more Federalist than it is Democrat-Republican. It's modeled more after Hamiltonian idealisms than it is Jeffersonian idealisms. The only flaw, a major flaw with the Federalist Party, is that they could not relate to the common man. They really couldn't. They couldn't relate to the common man, and that's going to kill them, and they're not going to understand that if they can't relate to the common man, they're going to have a hard time being voted in, and they will lose the next 3 or 4 elections. So the only Federalist president in American history is John Adams, and he was a one-term president. His presidency is marked by two power grabs. One of them we've talked about, the Alien and Sedition Act. And the next one we're going to talk about in a minute here, I'll jump ahead to it, is, here we go, the Judiciary Act of 1801. One last attempt by the Federalist Party to entrench themselves in one of the branches of government, and for a long time, because we know that all federal judges are in there for life. So what Adams tried to do was pack the court. Right? They talk now about packing the court. Well, Adams tried to pack the court. He created 16 new judge positions, and each one of those 16 positions, he put in strong Federalist. And he did this literally. He signed this into law the night before he left office. They call it the Midnight Judges incident. The Midnight Judges incident, where he tried to pack the court with anti-Jefferson judges. Well, Jefferson ended up vetoing some, and he allowed some to stay. But the realization came out that this was power grab attempt number 2 by the Federalists. So yeah, you could see now where their inability to relate to the common man, that's where it comes from. Common man was not happy with that, and they were not happy with the Alien Sedition Acts. Okay, a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson. He comes in and one of the first statements he makes, and it's an interesting one because of all the divisiveness at that time, much like the divisiveness you see today. He says, "We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists." That simple statement right there was a little bit of healing, where they said, "Come on, let's eliminate these party politics, and let's get on with building the country." He talked about honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none. So he's kind of adopting Washington's viewpoint: no alliances. President Jefferson sent his message to Congress to be read for a State of the Union address. You know that a State of the Union address is given every January. Washington and Adams gave theirs personally to Congress. Jefferson, who was shy and didn't like to speak publicly, said, "I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write it." And then he handed it to a clerk, who then would read his message. Well, that stayed that way all the way until 1912, when Woodrow Wilson became president, and he had a big agenda, as you'll learn later on in the year. And he personally gave a State of the Union address, and then every president since Wilson, since 1912, has given a State of the Union address. Culture, consistency, things go that way. All right. The other thing about Thomas Jefferson is he claimed to be the president of the people, the common man. There are some flaws in his thinking. He said the common man should rule as long as the common man is educated. Well, during this time, the only educated were the rich. They're all private schools, no public schools. So, yeah. But he one thing that Jefferson also did here is he didn't just overthrow all Federalist, programs. He didn't just say, I'm the new president and flip over the desk and just blow up everything that the Federalists did. He used some restraint, political restraint. So it says here, TJ's political restraint pointed the way toward two-party system that was later to become a characteristic feature of American politics as it is today. So he did things like he was determined to undo Federalist abuses by pardoning those Democrat Republicans who served jail time for violation of the Sedition Act. So on one hand, he pardoned people who were unjustly imprisoned. He also eliminated the Hamiltonian excise tax, but left a bunch of other Federalist programs intact. He did not attack the National Bank that he hated. So, like I said, he just didn't flip over the table and say there's a new sheriff in town and just want things to go exactly his way. He used political restraint. All right, talked about this. All right, let's talk about this guy. I'm going to tell you right now that there's a few people in history who don't get enough credit for shaping the way that we are today. This guy's one of them. I think Hamilton's another one. The system of government that we have today with the strong federal government and weaker states, it was molded by Hamilton. But then when Hamilton died, and also when the Federalist Party died, basically, because they couldn't relate to the common man, this guy remained as Chief Justice of the United States. He was Chief Justice of the United States for 34 years. Why? Because he could. They're in there for life. He was a strong Federalist. He believed in the Federalist Party. He believed in a strong government. His viewpoint was molded from his own personal experience as at Valley Forge, when he was frustrated because the federal government couldn't provide food and clothing to the Continental Army. And he said, if I'm ever in a position of power, I'm going to make sure that the federal government is strong and not this weak central government that can't do anything for us. And true to his word, almost every single case that he presided over, and we'll talk about some of them later in the year, almost every single case he presides over favors a strong federal government and weaker states. All right, we'll talk about one case today and then some others in a few weeks. But 34 years as Chief Justice of the United States. And even though the Federalist Party is dead, they had a Federalist Party icon in John Marshall. Here is his most well-known case that he presided over, and it was called Marbury versus Madison. A little background too is that John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson were cousins, and John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson hated each other, believe it or not. They were cousins, they were blood related, and they couldn't stand each other. They both had opposite views. Jefferson was a Democrat Republican, and Marshall was a strong Federalist. I mean, they really couldn't even be in the same room with each other, literally. So Marbury versus Madison was a case that slapped Jefferson on the wrist, kind of. So coming off of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where the state of Virginia and Kentucky deemed the Alien Sedition Acts unconstitutional, there's a lot of frustration by the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is the only body that could deem a law unconstitutional. That's it. States can't do that. And it happened. It says in the Constitution that the Supreme Court is responsible for the constitutionality of a law, not the states. So there's a lot of frustration, and Marshall wanted to make sure that this never happened again. In the case of Marbury versus Madison, had to do with some of the midnight judges. Not important about the case. What is important that came out of it, and what came out of it is it basically stated that the Supreme Court has the final say on the constitutionality of a law. It basically crystallized, made it clear, judicial review. Why did he feel the need to crystallize it? Because it had been violated by Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So Jefferson wasn't happy about that, because he wasn't happy about anything that Hamilton did, that Marshall did. And Jefferson would have liked nothing better. Nothing better. Jefferson would have been nothing better for him would have than impeaching Marshall, his cousin. But he didn't feel he was going to be able to do that. However, there was another justice on the Supreme Court, one of the 6 that they had at the time, and his name was Samuel Chase. And Samuel Chase was a strong Federalist, just like Marshall was. The difference is this guy was a lot more vocal in promoting the Federalist Party, which is blurred lines when it comes to, the Supreme Court. Once you're part of the Supreme Court, you are supposed to, your political affiliations are supposed to disappear. You're still gonna be conservative, like Chase was, but he shouldn't be promoting the Federalist Party over the Democrat-Republican Party. So they moved for impeachment. Jefferson pushed for it in hopes that if he could impeach Chase, next on his list of impeachments would be Marshall, his cousin. Well, the reason they're impeaching him is for showing Federalist viewpoints, and it didn't work. He was found innocent of the charges, which probably is the way it should have gone, because it's not high crimes and misdemeanors. Had he been successful, impeachment might be a lot easier. But Samuel Chase was impeached, but then was allowed to continue as he was found innocent of the charges. And as I said earlier, Burr presided over it and did a pretty good job too, presiding over it. Jefferson, when it comes to military, consistently inconsistent. He distrusted large standing armies because he was afraid of a coup, that the army would take over and eliminate him as president. He did reduce the military to 2,500 men. But then there was an incident in North Africa with the Barbary states that were stopping American ships that were trading and forcing Americans to pay bribe money. And Washington allowed this to happen because he didn't want war. Adams allowed it to happen. Jefferson put his foot down and said, that's not going to happen anymore. We're not going to be pushed around. So he reluctantly sent the Navy there, and they fought a war. He increased the size of the Navy, fought a war, and paid a lot of money to do that, to defeat the North African Barbary states in a small war in Tripoli. And inconsistently inconsistent. He was all about peace and getting along with everybody, but he's fighting a war. He's all about not spending a bunch of money, but then he spends a bunch of money. There are the Barbary states right there: Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. All right, I'll talk about the Louisiana Purchase here in part 2.